Hi, this is Chris with firstcenturychristianity.net. And today I'm asking a question. Do you know what time it is? Because that is a lot more complicated than one might think. In recent circumstances, I learned that there's something about our culture that is pretty much upside down. If you go buy a regular computer from the store, from Target or Walmart, you can probably get one for, 300 bucks, which is a lot of money. But if you want a better one, you pay more. And if you want a better one than that, you pay more. Same thing with cars. If you go out and buy a Toyota Camry, you're going to get a really good car. It's going to last a really long time, probably have cloth seats and, a decent engine, a decent transmission. But if you buy its Lexus counterpart, if you buy a Lexus ES, which is a Toyota Camry that's higher up, it has a different badge on it, you're going to pay a lot more money and it'll be faster and it'll have a lot of, creature comforts inside of it. Pretty much everywhere we go in our society, the more you pay, the more you get. And then I bought a wristwatch recently that's not super expensive by any stretch of the imagination. It was actually a couple of years ago I bought this thing and it started to malfunction and I needed to send it in for service because it was inaccurate. And my culture, my perspective, same as yours, now that we have these cell phones and digital watches and everything, that if you set a watch, that it should never be wrong. Or maybe once a month or once a year, you have to reset it to change it. And this thing was losing, 10 or 20 seconds a day, maybe even 40 seconds a day. It was a lot. So that's why I realized that it wasn't good. And I sent it back in for service. And I was wondering, why on earth did I buy a watch? How is it even possible for us to buy watches that are inaccurate, that don't keep time, that don't even keep pace with the time on the microwave oven or the time on the stove or the time on the we have the clock everywhere today. And so I started looking into this and realized that these really high-end watches, Omega or Rolex, all these Swiss watches and the Japanese equivalent, a lot of them, most of them, aren't that accurate. They will lose a couple seconds a day. In fact, it's completely reasonable for a wristwatch to cost thousands of dollars and lose 10 or 15 seconds per day. How could this even be? I know I'm completely confused. Why would somebody spend first, who's spending $10,000 on a watch to begin with? Who's spending $1,000 on a watch to begin with? Nobody's does that. But you can buy a beautiful watch today for, pretty reasonable amount of money if you chase sales, a couple $100 or whatever. And but why are they inaccurate? Well, it turns out that these watches and watch culture is holding on to craftsmanship. It's holding on to people. They want watches that were put together by human beings who are technicians, master watchsmiths or watch repair people. I'm sure there's a name for this. And they want something that was actually assembled and put together by another person or a group of people rather than having something that is manufactured. That's why the quartz watches that you could buy at Target or Walmart for 10 or 15 bucks that are supremely accurate aren't desirable because they're so easy to get. And people want to have something that's not a throwaway. They want to buy a wristwatch that's going to last decades, maybe something they can hand down as an heirloom. Now, this is a really interesting story, and it does keep a connection to history because the reason I bought the one that I have is because it reminds me of a wristwatch that my father had in the mid 80s, early 80s when I was a boy. When I was young, my father had a very nice Seiko watch that wound itself. And I remember pretending to be him and wearing it when he wasn't wearing it and shaking it to listen to it. So twice in my life, I have bought wristwatches that look like that one, because it reminds me of my dad. In fact, the one I bought first is almost identical to the one that my father had. And it may even be the same model. You never know. And so that's me, my connection to history, my connection to nostalgia, which is interesting, but not part of the biblical story of why I'm telling you the story of timekeeping. You see, in the Bible, it doesn't keep time the way we do. In any stretch of imagination, it doesn't keep time the way that you and I do. It doesn't have the same expectations of precision and accuracy that we have today, or that we have had for about the last 40 years. Now, if you were born in the 70s, maybe in the 80s, when you grew up and before, you had to have a wristwatch. You had to possess a wristwatch. Otherwise, you wouldn't know what time it was. And this is me chronicling how crazy our culture changes and how quickly it changes. Today, we don't need to have a wristwatch, and which is why when the last one that I had quit working, I kind of had it while cell phones got popular, and then I just never got another one because I always had a timepiece on me. Our cell phones turned into pocket watches. And so if you grew up, younger, you had watches and they were not accurate. If you had to wind your watch, or if it was a mechanical watch, you would have to set it periodically in order to be right. So the culture built up around that, where each town had a bell or a clock tower that they would clang at noon. Maybe they chimed it every hour or every half hour after that, so that people would know what time it was, because most people couldn't have timepieces. Most people couldn't afford it. And if they did, they weren't accurate. So they had to have a master clock in each town to set it. Now, I'm talking for hundreds and hundreds of years. Each town had its own master clock, and everybody set their watch to it, and nobody disagreed. Whoever was in charge of the town said it when it was noon. They had a timekeeper, and the clock went off, and then everybody went, oh, it's noon. And maybe some people would wind their watch and set it at that moment in time, so they would know, so it would be accurate for the next 24 hours or however long their watches stayed accurate. Before that, in biblical times, in ancient times, you had sunset and sunrise and noon were the three benchmarks of time for most of humanity. And that's just the way it is, because in Genesis, Yahweh created the heavens and the earth, and he said evening and morning is a day, evening and morning. So the transition from light to dark is a big contrast. So you can say that the day starts at sunset and then it ends, the next day ends at sunset. So that way you can see the transition from light to dark. Our day starts at midnight, which is impossible to reckon without timepieces. It's dark. What time is it? Don't know. There's no sun. The other thing happens is with calendars. And with the calendar, most of humanity did not have the same universal calendar. In fact, I think it's later in the Roman Empire where they actually did make a national calendar when they switched from Julian to Gregorian. That was a Pope thing. But the calendars were set regionally as well. In the Bible, the calendar was set by the high priest, who would make a decree that it was the new moon, and 2 silver trumpets would be blown, and that was the new moon. Nobody disagreed with the new moon. It wasn't anybody's job to call the new moon. It was the high priest's job to do that. And then the trumpets would be sounded, and then the word would spread either by signal fire or by horns. So some people wouldn't even know it was a new moon or new month for days, because it really didn't matter. If it wasn't a holy day, like the Feast of Trumpets, or if it wasn't, one of the Abib one, where you're going to start, looking for the lambs and stuff, it didn't really matter if it was a new moon or anything. For us, that's completely foreign, a completely foreign concept. We have to know exactly what time, what day it is all the time. And it's something that's steeped into our culture. The other thing that is very foreign for us is for different kingdoms to have different calendars and different cities to have different clocks. If we look at the Bible, it doesn't keep time as a world. It keeps time, meaning calendars, annuals, and years, based upon who was the king. It says in the 14th year of Hezekiah, in the 3rd year of Hosea, in the 137th year since Alexander the Great invaded. It keeps time based upon who's leading that region of the world. So if you were in the Roman Empire, you had a calendar that was different from the people who were in the Persian Empire. And it didn't matter It didn't matter because time passes without what we call it anyway. So this history of time that affects our culture is very intriguing because we used to have to set watches. We have to wear watches. I did not like wearing watches. I didn't care for it, probably because I was too poor to be able to afford one that actually fit right or was actually made out of good material. It was sweaty. It was not good. You always had this tan line, and I didn't like it, but you had to do it in order to know where to be, in order to have, to function in society. And what happened in the history was that in the mid 80s, this quartz movement came out where everything got super accurate. And that's when we started getting clocks on our microwave ovens and clocks everywhere because it was very cheap to have timepieces and they were very accurate. Now, the history of our actual master clock, which you probably don't know why it exists, but if you look at the clock in the tray of your computer and you look at your iPhone or you look at your kid's iPhone, or if you have an iWatch, they all have exactly the same time. Do you ever think, how does that happen? It's because we have an atomic clock. There is a master clock for the entire world now that is accurate within 1 second every 20 million years. This came about in the 1940s when we were doing a lot of work on physics in order to stop the Nazis and Tojo's Japan. They determined that using these atomic radioactive sources that they could make clocks and keep time infinitely more accurate than we could with timepieces. And so 1967, the world's timekeeping became based on the atomic clock and was divorced from the rotation of the Earth. That's biblical. We stopped using a sundial. We stopped using the position of the Earth relative to the sun for keeping time in 1967. It's important for the Bible because in the end times, we know that every eye will see it, every tongue will confess, every knee will bow. There is an international clock and an international monetary policy and an international global trade system in the end of days, and that had to start somewhere. Now, I'm not telling you to stop using this. I know a lot of people in our movement will learn some truth like this and say, well, I'm not using that pagan clock anymore. But of course, we're going to use the clock and the time because we have to. And the Bible shows believers and non-believers existing together all the way up until the return of the Messiah, where the dead and Messiah rise first. We will live through the tribulation, and we have to be able to function in society to a degree. We do not have to take the mark of the beast, and we do not have to, bow the knee to any false gods or anything. But we do have to function, and keeping time is not a big deal. Of course, most of us will keep the master clock on top of, or in addition to, the Hebrew calendar, because the Hebrew calendar is how we celebrate Passover and Sukkot, Yom Teruah, Yom Kippur. So we use the Julian calendar in conjunction with the Hebrew calendar. But today we know exactly when the new moon is going to be because we have astronomy. We have all these infinite, technology that we didn't have back in the day. All this thing adds up to us reading the Bible with a culture that is not in the Bible. And it also shows that how quickly culture can change. Because within my lifetime, when I was a youngster, I had to have a wristwatch in order to know what time to be home. But that's why little kids used to be taught to come home when the street lights came on, because they didn't have clocks. They didn't have wristwatches. That was their culture at the time. Today, the children have iPhones and Samsung phones from a very early age, and they can have a wristwatch because you can almost buy a wristwatch out of a gumball dispenser at this point. They're so inexpensive. What is interesting about this atomic clock, though, is that in 1975, a clock was made that didn't lose or gain a second in 300,000 years. And then that wasn't good enough. They had to keep going. In 1999, a clock was made that didn't lose or gain a second in 20 million years. Now comes the fun part. How does that get to your phones? there is a master atomic clock, and the time is broadcast up to satellites, which filters down through cell towers and the internet to give us the exact same time to the second, probably millisecond, on our computers and our cell phones. We are all on exactly the same time through these miraculous inventions of mankind. They even use math to calculate the latency of the signal so that we can be on the same milliseconds. It's amazing technology. This broadcast, this atomic clock broadcast, where you can buy a wristwatch for $200, $250 that will set itself on the atomic clock. Did you know that? That these radio waves are all around us to tell us exactly which time it is so we can all be on the same exact clock? Doesn't it say something in the book of Daniel that the beast system's going to change times and law? Isn't that a little biblical? I don't know. Sounds like it to me. But the point of all this fun stuff, is that when we read the Bible, it keeps time much different than we do, and it's almost impossible for us to relate to it. Those of us who've been keeping the festivals for years understand the agricultural cycle, understand the cycle of Yahweh's calendar a little bit, but we don't actually live it, do we? We don't have a priest telling us when it is. We have a calculated calendar, which is amazingly accurate considering it was made at about, we don't know when it was made. It was probably in use during the Second Temple, and the calculations were released in the 300s AD, and those calculations continue to be accurate to this point in time. I know some people don't like these calculations. They don't like the calculated calendar, but you understand how accurate it is now, 1600 years down the road, maybe even 2,000 years down the road. It's still working, and it's still incredibly accurate. When we look at the Bible and we look at time, we often read into it our culture today and think that if we don't know the exact moment that the Messiah was born and the exact moment that he died and that's not how the Bible works at all. The Bible doesn't have that expectation of accuracy most of the time. The death of the Messiah is very, very accurate within the prophecy of Daniel, where it talks about the rebuilding of the temple. But even still, that can be within a couple years and still be considered true. If you think about, Herod had a decree to kill all the children that were 2 years and under. So the Messiah could be born within a window, and his ministry could be within a window that's much bigger than you and I would even dare to accept today, because we are accustomed to our speedometers and our chronometers and all of our gadgetry being 100% accurate. So keep that in mind as you go through your Bible studies, that if something doesn't quite wash, if it doesn't quite come out, it doesn't mean you need to throw it away. It just means we don't quite understand. Maybe we don't understand the culture. Maybe we don't understand the prophecy. There's a couple of places one place in particular that I would caution, though, is with the death and resurrection of the Messiah. He said that the only sign that he was the Messiah was to be buried in the tomb for 3 days and 3 nights, as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale. 3 days and 3 nights is a literal expression of about 72 hours. A day and a night is not a euphemism. It's a literal thing, an evening and a morning. That's what he's talking about, is 24-hour cycles. So the Messiah had to have been crucified and put in the tomb somewhere close to 72 hours. Friday sunset to Sunday before the sun comes up is not even close. That's like 38 hours. It's barely halfway there. So we know that's not true. But it still doesn't have to be exact to the minute. I bet you in that prophecy, though, it actually was exact to the minute. Don't you think? Other things, the return of the Messiah, when we talk at our assembly and we talk about the time it took for Israel to apostasy with the Greeks, was a long time. It was decades and decades before they started to blend in with the Greeks for the Maccabean revolt. The invasion of Israel in 70 AD, Judea, I'm using Israel and Judea as synonyms, didn't happen in 80, 70. It's not like he just said, okay, we're going to take these people out and that's that. That invasion took 5 to 6 years and consumed millions of lives as the Romans marched across Judea to destroy the place. In our brains, we think like movies. We think that, oh, okay, Rome decided to kill everybody, so they already have the troops there, so they just did it. That's not how that happened at all. You read the history from Josephus, you read other histories, and you realize that the Roman decision to take out Israel was probably earlier than 65 AD. And then they had to muster the troops, and they had to muster the wealth, and they had to bring all the stuff in, and the diaspora, and all these things take a lot of time. And I know as we read prophecy, we think, oh, 3.5 years, tribulation, it's going to be exact. And we know, if we know the starting point, we know the end. It's not how that's going to happen, brothers and sisters. Because while we function on these miraculous calendars and these miraculous timepieces that are where we complain about them being inaccurate if they're 15 seconds off in a day, that's not how the Bible works out. The Bible's a little sloppier than that. In fact, in some cases, it's a lot sloppier than that. So when you go through your studies, just keep in mind that things don't have to be exact in order to be true. May Yahweh bless you and keep you. In the name of his son, Yeshua, have a blessed week, everybody.